They slapped an $8 million flood damage bill on my door, claimed I owned a river I had never touched, and threatened to ruin my life for a neighborhood I didn't even belong to. But before you take the HOA's side, wait until you hear how one old map, one forgotten easement, and one government inspector turned their power trip into the most expensive mistake of their lives. If you enjoy real stories where bullies overreach and get exposed by their own arrogance, subscribe now, because this one proves that sometimes the truth doesn't just win, it drowns the liars who tried to bury it. The first time I saw the number $8 million printed in bold at the top of an envelope addressed to me, I genuinely thought it was a scam, the kind that preys on panic and confusion, because nothing in my quiet, practical life had ever flirted with figures like that, let alone tied them to a river I didn't own, control, or even think about. But the letterhead was real, the signatures were real, and the threat was very real. And while I had never joined, never voted in, and never even driven through, was claiming that catastrophic flooding in their upscale development was my fault because, according to them, I owned and controlled the river corridor, upstream, a phrase that sounded impressive until you realized it was meaningless legal fluff designed to scare someone into paying. And the reason they chose me was simple. I owned a piece of rural land that bordered a narrow, slow-moving river miles away from their subdivision, land I had inherited from my grandfather, land that had existed peacefully for decades before their manicured lawns and decorative bridges ever showed up on satellite imagery. And at first I laughed because the idea that I somehow controlled rainfall, gravity, and hydrology was absurd, but the laughter stopped when the second letter arrived, then the third, each more aggressive than the last, each citing emergency repairs, homeowner losses, and temporary mitigation costs, all allegedly caused by my failure to maintain the river, a river that, according to state law, was classified as a navigable waterway under public jurisdiction, something my grandfather had explained to me when I was a kid fishing on its banks, telling me that you could own the land beside a river but never the river itself. And I remembered that clearly as I read their demand, because memory has a way of surfacing when someone tries to rewrite reality. And the HOA's president, a man whose name appeared at the bottom of every letter like a stamp of entitlement, even showed up one afternoon with 2 other board members, walking onto my property without permission, pointing toward the water as if it were a misbehaving pet, telling me I needed to take responsibility, because their neighborhood had flooded after a historic storm. And they spoke to me slowly, loudly, the way people do when they assume the other person is ignorant, explaining that if I didn't pay, they would sue, lien my property, and make this very painful. And I asked them a simple question: how exactly did they believe I controlled a river governed by state and federal law? And they responded with a rehearsed answer about riparian responsibility, a term they clearly didn't understand, because riparian rights grant use, not ownership, and certainly not liability for downstream development decisions. But they were confident, dangerously confident, because their subdivision had money, lawyers on retainer, and a habit of getting their way. And I later learned why they were so aggressive. The flood had been devastating. Water had rushed through their decorative retention ponds, overwhelmed undersized culverts, and turned basements into swimming pools, and insurance companies had started asking uncomfortable questions about whether the development complied with modern floodplain regulations, questions the HOA didn't want to answer. So instead they looked upstream for a scapegoat, someone outside their membership they could bully without political backlash, and they landed on me, the quiet landowner with an old truck and a last name that didn't open doors. And when I refused to pay, the lawsuit came exactly as promised, a thick packet filled with jargon accusing me of negligence, obstruction, and failure to maintain natural water flow, claims so bold they would have been laughable if they weren't filed in an actual court. And that's when fear crept in, because I wasn't wealthy, I didn't have an army of lawyers, and even a frivolous lawsuit can crush someone through sheer cost. But instead of panicking, I went back to the basics, back to my grandfather's lessons, back to the land itself, because land remembers things people try to erase. And I dug out old county plats, yellowed survey maps, and deed records that showed the river's course long before the HOA existed, documents that clearly labeled the waterway as public, with a conservation easement established decades earlier after a major flood event that, ironically, was the very reason modern rules existed to prevent exactly what had just happened to their neighborhood. And as I dug deeper, the story became clearer and uglier, because the HOA's developer had built aggressively close to the floodplain, using outdated models to justify smaller drainage infrastructure. And when the county updated its flood maps years later, the HOA successfully lobbied to delay enforcement, buying time but increasing risk. And when the storm hit, a once-in-a-generation rain event that meteorologists had actually predicted, the water followed physics, not paperwork, spilling into areas that never should have been built on. And instead of accepting responsibility, the HOA decided to rewrite history by claiming the river had been altered upstream, a claim they couldn't support because I had never touched it beyond clearing fallen branches after storms, something allowed and encouraged by the local conservation office, and my attorney, a calm woman with a voice like steel wrapped in silk, saw through their strategy immediately, explaining that they weren't trying to win on facts, they were trying to win through intimidation, hoping I'd settle out of fear, but she also warned me that arrogance like theirs often leads to overreach, and overreach leaves fingerprints, so instead of rushing to settle, we filed discovery requests that forced the HOA to open its books, engineering reports, and internal emails, and what came out was staggering, because buried in their own documents were warnings from consultants years earlier stating that their stormwater system would fail in extreme weather, warnings the board acknowledged and then ignored because upgrades would have required higher dues and reduced profits for the developer, and there were emails discussing the optics of blaming upstream landowners if flooding ever occurred, casual, cynical messages written by people who assumed they'd never be read aloud in a courtroom, and the turning point came when a state environmental inspector, alerted by our filings, decided to conduct an independent review of the river corridor, and that inspector didn't just look at my land, they followed the water downstream, documenting illegal grading, unpermitted retaining walls, and culverts installed without proper capacity, all within the HOA's boundaries, and suddenly the narrative flipped, because now the question wasn't whether I owed them money, it was whether they had violated state environmental laws, and when the inspector's preliminary findings were entered into the record, the judge's tone changed, his patience thinning with every exaggerated claim the HOA's attorney tried to make, and the HOA panicked, offering a confidential settlement where they'd forgive the $8 million if I agreed to share minor responsibility, something my attorney advised me to reject, because accepting even a sliver of blame would protect them from broader liability, and that was when the final twist emerged, because during a site visit, the inspector noticed something subtle near the HOA's entrance, a decorative waterfall feature that diverted water from the natural drainage path into a man-made channel leading straight into their neighborhood, installed years earlier for aesthetics, not function, and that feature, undocumented and unpermitted, acted like a funnel during heavy rain, accelerating flow into the very areas that flooded, and once that was discovered, the case collapsed like wet cardboard, the HOA withdrew its lawsuit, the judge dismissed their claims with prejudice, and the state initiated its own enforcement action against the HOA for environmental violations, fines that dwarfed the $8 million they had tried to pin on me, and the irony was delicious, because the same board members who had stood on my land threatening me now stood before regulators explaining why they thought rules didn't apply to them, and when the dust settled, I didn't just walk away free, I was awarded legal fees for their bad faith litigation, while the HOA faced mandatory infrastructure upgrades, increased insurance premiums, and a reputation so damaged that home values dipped, all because they couldn't accept responsibility for their own choices. And sometimes, when I walk along the river at dusk, listening to the water move the way it always has, indifferent to human ego, I think about how close I came to being crushed by a lie written on expensive paper, and how power often assumes silence as weakness, forgetting that patience, records, and truth can turn even an $8 million threat into a lesson no bully ever forgets.